The summer sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first speakers hit full volume on the floating dock I'd spent 3 weekends building from scratch. It wasn't just any lake party. This was the lake party, my birthday, the annual Lake E. Bash, and the long-overdue reminder to the neighborhood that just because they had matching mailboxes didn't mean they controlled me, my property, or my water. For years, the HOA had pecked away at my freedom like a vulture circling roadkill, warning letters for non-uniform fencing, complaints about non-conforming mailbox designs, and threats over unregistered watercraft. But this time, I had receipts. Real ones. A thick federal permit signed not just by some low-level pencil pusher, but by the regional director himself, who, as luck would have it, was an old friend of my father and fully aware of the nonsense the HOA had been pulling around this lake. They claimed they owned a say in what happened on the lake, citing outdated maps, vague covenants, and long-forgotten bylaws, but the lake had been dredged, expanded, and reclassified as part of a larger environmental stewardship program funded by federal grants. Translation? They had no say, zero jurisdiction. And yet, here I was, sipping a beer at 9:30 a.m. on a floating platform that held a full DJ setup, inflatable flamingos, a barbecue grill, and a cooler the size of a bathtub, waiting for the storm I knew was coming. It didn't take long. At precisely 10:17 a.m., as if summoned by the thump of bass and the smell of burgers, the HOA president herself arrived. Marjorie Ellsworth, a woman who dressed like she was perpetually on her way to a funeral and spoke like the Constitution had personally wronged her. She came charging down the shoreline in her powder blue two-piece, her ever-present clipboard in hand, heels clicking across the concrete path as though stomping out the joy she saw before her. She shouted something I couldn't hear over the music, so I waved like an idiot and turned the volume up just a notch. That did it. She pulled out her phone and started dialing, pacing back and forth while pointing at the lake like she expected it to obey. Not 5 minutes later, I saw the sheriff's cruiser pull up, Deputy Harris, a good guy caught in a bad job, who already looked exhausted by the time he stepped out of the vehicle. "Morning, folks," he called out, voice raised over the music. "Mind turning that down a bit so we can talk?" I obliged, not because I had to, but because I knew this scene would go viral, and I wanted every word captured clearly. The body cam, my dock cam, the bystanders filming on their phones, all witnesses to what came next. Marjorie stormed toward the edge of the dock like she was ready to walk on water, gesturing wildly. "This is a clear violation of community codes," she barked. "Floating structures, amplified noise, and unauthorized gatherings are not allowed on shared lakefront property." I stood up slowly, exaggerated like I was on stage, and pulled a laminated document from my pocket. "You're half right," I said with a smile. "But unfortunately for you, this lake isn't shared property anymore. It's under federal jurisdiction now." Then I handed it to Deputy Harris. You could almost hear the air deflate from Marjorie as Harris took his time reading the permit. It wasn't just a single page. It was a packet, complete with maps, signatures, legal references, and a letter from the Army Corps of Engineers confirming the reclassification of the water body. Marjorie kept trying to interject, but Harris held up one hand without looking up. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to let me finish reading this." She fumed beside him, cheeks turning the same red as the solo cups stacked on my party table. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You can't just host a rave in the middle of a neighborhood." "It's not a rave," I said. "It's a permitted recreational event on privately maintained water overseen by the federal government. And you're welcome to leave at any time." That last line did it. Her eyes went wide like someone had finally dared to flip the script. She turned to Harris again, fishing for backup, but the man just handed her the packet. "He's right, Marjorie. This is legit." Her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish, no words coming out. Behind her, more neighbors were gathering, some watching with arms crossed in judgment, others clearly enjoying the show. The DJ spun a new track and someone shouted, "Let him party!" Laughter rippled across the shoreline, but Marjorie wasn't done, not by a long shot. "This isn't over," she hissed, pointing at me like a curse. "There are other authorities, fire marshal, zoning board. Just you wait." I saluted her with my drink. "I'll be right here." The party picked up again after that, but beneath the music and the sunshine, a cold war had begun. Over the next few days, the HOA sent a barrage of emails, letters, and even a certified warning that I was in violation of some imaginary section of the community charter. I posted every one of them online. I included the federal permit with each post. The internet had a field day. Memes exploded. Marjorie photoshopped onto sinking ships. HOA signs replaced with party banners. Even local news picked up the story. One anchor called it a battle of bureaucracy versus beer. I laughed, but I also stayed ready. The next weekend, as predicted, a fire inspector showed up unannounced. He seemed more interested in the hot dogs than the heat sources, and after reviewing the paperwork I'd emailed ahead of time, he gave me a thumbs up. A drone from the county zoning office circled overhead the following day, but all it captured was a man reclining in a floaty, holding a copy of the Constitution and waving like royalty. Still, Marjorie doubled down. She started sending lake patrols, volunteers with clipboards and binoculars, who stood on shore documenting every inflatable, every gathering, every time someone played music louder than a whisper. One of them tripped and fell into the water trying to take pictures, and I saved the footage for my highlight reel. When that didn't work, she tried shaming the guests, sending letters to attendees, warning them they could be banned from future HOA events if they associated with me. It backfired spectacularly. Suddenly, everyone wanted to come to my lake parties. People brought food, drinks, paddle boards, lawn chairs. The floating dock became a symbol of freedom from the petty tyranny of HOA rule. Someone even spray-painted "Marjorie can't swim" on a pool noodle and floated it past her house. As summer peaked, I expanded the dock into a series of platforms, one for the grill, one for the DJ, and one labeled The Court, where I held mock trials reading HOA notices out loud and letting guests vote to reject them by tossing them into a shredder. The events became legendary. We had BYOF nights, bring your own floaty, sunrise yoga sessions, and even a 4th of July fireworks show approved by, you guessed it, a federal coordinator. Every time Marjorie tried to stop it, she was met with a new wall of legality and laughter. The harder she pushed, the more ridiculous she looked, and the more support I gained. What she didn't realize was that the lake had become more than just a place to blow off steam. It had become a rallying point. People were tired of overregulation, of power-hungry HOAs treating communities like dictatorships. My floating dock, once a birthday gag, had turned into a floating protest, colorful, musical, and legally airtight. Even the sheriff started showing up, not to shut it down, but to eat ribs and watch the show. When Marjorie finally tried to file a formal injunction, the judge tossed it in under 10 minutes. "Not only is the lake beyond your scope," he said, "but the party has become an established expression of peaceful assembly and personal recreation." The courtroom broke into applause. Marjorie stormed out, humiliated. And I went home, lit up the dock with extra lights, turned the music up, and started planning the next big bash. I knew she'd be back, that there'd be more schemes, more complaints. But I also knew something else. She'd already lost. She lost the minute she thought a clipboard could beat a constitution, that a rule book could override a federal permit. That intimidation could win over preparation. And as I floated under the stars that night, drink in hand and music in the background, I smiled. Because on my lake, under my lights, flying my permits, there was only one rule that mattered. You don't mess with the Dock King. By the time mid-August rolled around, the lake parties had practically become a cultural movement. What began as a defiant birthday celebration had turned into a weekly phenomenon, with floats stretching farther out into the water like spokes. On a wheel, each platform buzzing with activity, grills sizzling, music thumping, laughter rolling over the waves. I'd even built a floating minibar out of reclaimed wood and coolers, stocked by neighbors who wanted nothing more than to see Marjorie's power crumble like stale crackers. But despite all our wins, I knew better than to let my guard down. The HOA wasn't dead. It was just reloading. And true to form, they came back not with one lawsuit, but 4. Noise ordinance violations, environmental disruption, unauthorized commercial activity, and my personal favorite, threat to community cohesion. That last one made me laugh so hard I nearly fell off my paddleboard. But the paperwork was real, filed in county court, and while flimsy, still required a response. My lawyer, yes, I had one now, was practically giddy. "It's rare I get to dismantle this kind of nonsense in real time," she said, flipping through the paperwork. "They've got nothing, but they're throwing everything, hoping one stick will break your dock." Still, we responded formally. We provided documentation, referenced statutes, and included a signed statement from the federal environmental liaison who had personally attended our 4th of July fireworks display. But even as we won the legal battle again, the HOA began shifting tactics. No longer content to fight in court, they turned to something worse: public perception. They printed flyers accusing me of polluting the lake, endangering children, and hosting unlicensed alcohol-fueled raves. They slid them under doors, posted them on bulletin boards, even tried to sneak them into mailboxes, but I had countermeasures: cameras, screenshots, and a growing social media presence that documented every desperate move they made. My floating dock now had its own Instagram page, Dock Dynasty, and we had fans from as far away as Florida and Oregon cheering us on. We'd post live stories every weekend with guests shouting, "We got the permit!" as they cannonballed into the water. And for every lie Marjorie spread, we had 5 reels of truth. Kids playing cornhole, families barbecuing, seniors floating lazily with sun hats and lemonade. It wasn't a party anymore. It was a peaceful rebellion. But Marjorie wasn't alone now. A new figure had entered the ring: Kenneth Rawlins, a retired litigation consultant and self-declared property law enthusiast who had moved into the neighborhood 3 months earlier and immediately joined the HOA board. Where Marjorie was all emotion and volume, Kenneth was cold calculation. He didn't yell. He wrote letters, long ones, legal ones, filled with references to obscure zoning terms and cleverly twisted statutes. I'll admit, I got nervous when his name started showing up on envelopes, but my lawyer wasn't fazed. "He's a dinosaur from a dead age of bureaucracy," she told me. "He's betting on fear. You've got transparency, tech, and truth." Still, Kenneth's tactics were more subtle. He began filing anonymous noise complaints with the county. When those didn't work, he started submitting environmental concerns to the local conservation agency, claiming our floating docks disrupted bird migration. That resulted in an actual site visit. A biologist showed up with a clipboard and drone, spent half a day documenting the scene, and left with a hot dog and an invitation to the next party. Her final report: no significant ecological disruption observed. Community engagement appears high and positive. Another win, but the pressure kept mounting. Kenneth filed a complaint with the fire department, arguing our floating grill platforms were flammable hazards. We responded with fire extinguishers, safety protocols, and videos of our fire marshal-approved setup. The complaint was dropped, but the message was clear. They were trying to outlast me, and then they made their biggest mistake. One evening, I returned home to find my floating dock partially dismantled, ropes cut, screws removed, one of the pontoons punctured and slowly sinking into the water. It wasn't kids. It wasn't weather. This was deliberate sabotage. I filed a police report, sent the footage from the security camera I'd mounted on shore, and waited. 2 days later, the police came knocking, except not for me. They had a warrant to search Marjorie's garage. Turns out one of her Lake Patrol volunteers had bragged in a private Facebook group about doing what had to be done. The post included a photo of the guy in a kayak with a crowbar, grinning like he'd just solved climate change. It was all the police needed. Charges were filed: trespassing, vandalism, property damage. The HOA tried to claim it was a rogue actor, but the evidence showed otherwise. Marjorie had coordinated it. The cops had texts. That, finally, was her downfall. The HOA called an emergency meeting, residents only. I wasn't invited, of course, but word spread fast. Marjorie stepped down under pressure, citing unjust public scrutiny, and Kenneth, seeing the writing on the wall, resigned 2 days later. That should have been the end of it. But bureaucracies are like weeds. Cut one head off, 2 more grow in its place. A new interim board formed, and while they weren't as aggressive, they were cautious, suspicious, and quietly resentful. They didn't escalate, but they didn't embrace the lake parties either. Which was fine by me. I'd proven my point. We'd won. So I scaled things back. Fewer parties, more community events. I invited local artists to perform acoustic sets. We held open mic nights and floating movie screenings. Slowly, neighbors who'd stayed quiet during the chaos began to join in. The lake stopped being a battleground and returned to being what it always should have been: a shared place of joy, freedom, and floating fun. But I kept the permit framed on my wall, just in case. The lake was quiet again, but this time it wasn't because someone tried to shut us down. It was the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and everything settles into place. The floating dock, once a symbol of defiance, had become something else entirely. It was no longer about fighting the HOA or flexing the permit. It was about community now. The people who used to peek through their blinds had started walking down to the shore with folding chairs and crock pots. Even the ones who never spoke to anyone had started waving across the water. The same neighbors who once signed HOA complaints now helped string lights across the dock or brought board games on mellow evenings. A sort of truce had formed, not because we'd agreed on everything, but because we'd stopped trying to control one another. The new HOA board, cautious but not combative, had quietly taken the path of least resistance. They no longer filed reports or sent passive-aggressive flyers. Instead, they started asking questions like, "Do you think the next event could include a cleanup effort?" And "Would you be open to adding life jackets for the kids?" And you know what? We said yes, because we weren't trying to win anymore. We were trying to live. The cops never came again. Probably because they'd seen enough to know we weren't the problem. Even the county office, which had once reluctantly reviewed every petty complaint, had stopped bothering. They knew we had the permit. They knew we weren't hurting anyone. But more importantly, they knew we had become a community that worked things out on our own. One night, I looked around during a floating movie event. Just a projector, a white sheet, and a raft full of popcorn. There were no fences between us anymore, no accusations, just laughter bouncing off the water and glow sticks floating like fireflies. And for the first time since all this started, I felt like I could finally let go of the chip on my shoulder. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I'd already done that. The permit stayed framed on my wall, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what can happen when someone stands up, not just with paperwork, but with patience, creativity, and a little stubbornness. So yeah, the HOA called the cops. They tried to shut me down, but all they did was spark something stronger than rules or regulations. A community that actually gave a damn. And that's something no complaint form can ever erase.